In October of 1965, in the quiet neighborhoods of Indianapolis, Indiana, a story unfolded that remains one of the darkest and most disturbing in American history. It was not a crime committed in secrecy by a stranger lurking in the shadows. It was not an act of violence that erupted suddenly in a moment of rage. This was something far more chilling. A young girl, only 16 years old, was entrusted to the care of an adult, placed in a home that was supposed to provide stability while her parents traveled for work. But instead of protection, instead of guidance, she encountered weeks of torment that would end in her slow and agonizing death. Her name was Sylvia Likens. The name Sylvia Likens still carries weight among detectives, prosecutors, and historians who have studied the case. Her story is not simply one of abuse. It is the story of betrayal on every possible level. A betrayal by the caregiver who promised to look after her. A betrayal by children who should have been her peers, but instead became her tormentors. And a betrayal by neighbors and bystanders who saw the signs, who heard the cries, but who did not act until it was far too late. This is the account of Sylvia's final weeks, where the ordinary setting of a family home transformed into a place of unimaginable suffering. The house belonged to Gertrude Baniszewski, a woman in her mid-30s with 7 children of her own. When Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny were placed in her care, no one could have predicted the horror that would unfold within those walls. Yet, as time passed, what began as small punishments escalated into a campaign of cruelty, carried out not only by Gertrude, but by her children and even other neighborhood kids who visited the house. Sylvia became the target of a cruelty so severe, so relentless, that her story has been described by seasoned investigators as unlike anything they had ever encountered. What makes this case even more disturbing is the sheer number of people who took part, either through direct involvement or through silence. This was not the act of a single violent offender, but a collective participation in suffering where one girl's humanity was stripped away piece by piece, while others watched or joined in. And as the weeks dragged on, Sylvia's condition grew worse. She was beaten, humiliated, starved, and eventually confined to the basement of the Baniszewski home. By the time authorities were finally called, Sylvia's body bore the evidence of every moment of pain she had endured. In this episode, we will examine the life of Sylvia Likens, the twisted actions of Gertrude Baniszewski, the involvement of children and neighbors, the investigation that followed, and the trial that left the nation horrified. This is not just a story about crime. It is a story about the failure of compassion, about the consequences of silence, and about the unimaginable suffering of a girl who deserved so much more than the fate she endured. If you value in-depth examinations of true crime stories that uncover both the facts and the human cost, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Before the horror of Sylvia Likens' final weeks can be understood, it is necessary to know who she was, where she came from, and how she and her sister ended up in the home of Gertrude Baniszewski. Sylvia Marie Likens was born on January 3, 1949, in Lebanon, Indiana. She was the third child of Lester and Betty Likens. Her family was not wealthy. In fact, the Likens family survived by working for traveling carnivals, selling food and refreshments at state fairs and other events. This lifestyle meant constant movement. Stability was often fleeting. Sylvia and her 4 siblings grew up in an environment where they had to adjust quickly, relying on one another for comfort and familiarity. Despite the challenges, Sylvia was known as a kind, shy, and polite girl. Those who remembered her spoke of a teenager who loved music, enjoyed roller skating, and tried to keep a cheerful spirit, even when her circumstances were difficult. Sylvia's sister Jenny had suffered from polio as a child, which left her with a limp and required her to wear a leg brace. Sylvia, being protective by nature, often took it upon herself to defend and care for Jenny. The two were close, bound together by their reliance on each other in a world that was often unstable. This protective bond would play a heartbreaking role in the events that unfolded later, as Jenny was forced to watch helplessly while Sylvia suffered. Lester and Betty Likens, while caring for their children, struggled financially. They often needed to travel with the carnival, sometimes leaving their children in the care of relatives or trusted acquaintances. In July of 1965, the couple faced a familiar situation. They were preparing to go on the road again and needed someone to watch over Sylvia and Jenny. Through acquaintances, they were introduced to Gertrude Baniszewski. Gertrude was a 37-year-old woman living in a modest rented home at 3850 East New York Street in Indianapolis. She had 7 children of her own, ranging from toddler age to late teens. On the surface, Gertrude appeared to be a struggling single mother, trying to provide for her large family after 2 failed marriages. She was described by some as quiet, thin, and frail. Yet beneath that appearance was a woman deeply troubled, plagued by poor health, poverty, resentment, and a need for control. Lester Likens, seeking a stable environment for his daughters, agreed to pay Gertrude $20 a week to care for Sylvia and Jenny. The arrangement was meant to provide safety and security while their parents worked. To Lester and Betty, it must have seemed like a reasonable solution. Gertrude had children of her own. She lived in a neighborhood surrounded by families, and she appeared willing to help. There was little reason to suspect that this decision would lead to tragedy, but what no one knew then was that the home Sylvia was being placed in was not safe. It was not a place of care or protection. Behind its worn doors, tension simmered. Gertrude's household was marked by poverty, instability, and a growing bitterness. She was often ill, chain-smoked constantly, and had difficulty maintaining discipline in her household. Children came and went freely. Supervision was lax. And within this chaotic environment, Sylvia Likens, with her shy smile and polite manners, was about to step into the most dangerous chapter of her life. What began as a temporary guardianship would soon unravel into an ordeal that shocked even hardened police officers. And it all started with that fateful agreement: $20 a week, a promise of care, and the trust of parents who could not imagine the danger waiting behind Gertrude Baniszewski's door. When Sylvia and Jenny Likens first moved into the Baniszewski home in the summer of 1965, there was no immediate sign of the nightmare that lay ahead. At first, things seemed ordinary. Sylvia tried to fit in with the other children, helping with chores and looking after Jenny. She attended church with the family, made small talk with neighbors, and appeared to adjust as best she could. But beneath the surface, tensions were forming. The weekly payments that Lester Likens had promised to Gertrude arrived late at times, and this delay became the first spark of resentment. Gertrude, already struggling with her own poverty and poor health, began to take out her frustrations on Sylvia. What started as harsh words soon escalated into physical punishments. Sylvia, seen as the stronger of the 2 sisters, became the primary target. Jenny, because of her disability, was often spared direct attacks, but was forced to witness the abuse, adding another layer of cruelty to what was happening. At first, the punishments were beatings with a belt or paddle. Sylvia would be struck for small infractions, often without clear reason. But as the weeks went by, the abuse intensified. Food was withheld, leaving Sylvia hungry and weak. She was insulted and humiliated in front of others. The children in the household, taking cues from Gertrude, began to join in. What should have been Sylvia's peers became participants in her suffering. The cruelty took many forms. On one occasion, Sylvia was falsely accused of spreading rumors about Gertrude's daughters. Enraged, Gertrude forced Sylvia to strip in front of the group and shoved a glass bottle into her body, a violation so severe that Sylvia cried out in agony while the others looked on. On another occasion, Gertrude permitted neighborhood children to come into the house, encouraging them to strike Sylvia, to kick her, to burn her with cigarettes. What began as Gertrude's discipline became a spectacle of torment, a horrifying game played at Sylvia's expense. As the abuse continued, Sylvia's physical condition deteriorated. She grew thin from starvation, her body covered with bruises, burns, and cuts. Yet the cruelty was not only physical, she was subjected to constant psychological torment. Gertrude told others that Sylvia was a prostitute, branding her with lies designed to destroy her dignity. Eventually, Gertrude heated a needle and forced it into Sylvia's flesh, carving the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," into her stomach. This act symbolized the complete stripping away of Sylvia's humanity. By October, Sylvia was no longer allowed to live upstairs. She was forced into the basement, where she lay on the concrete floor, weak, injured, and alone. She was denied water, denied food, and treated worse than an animal. Even then, her spirit showed signs of resistance. In rare moments of clarity, she begged for help, whispered to Jenny to stay strong, and tried to cling to some piece of hope. But the abuse was relentless, and her body could no longer endure the punishment. On October 26, 1965, after weeks of unimaginable suffering, Sylvia Likens succumbed to her injuries. By the time authorities were called, it was too late. What they discovered shocked even the most experienced officers, her broken body bearing the marks of prolonged torture, and a story that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. On the evening of October 26, 1965, a call was placed from the Baniszewski residence to the Indianapolis police. Gertrude Baniszewski reported that a 16-year-old girl had died in her home. When officers arrived, they were met with a carefully staged scene. Sylvia's lifeless body lay on a mattress in a filthy room. A handwritten note was found nearby. According to Gertrude, Sylvia had run away with a group of boys, had returned injured, and had collapsed. The note seemed to confirm this story, but almost immediately something about the scene felt wrong. The officers noticed Sylvia's condition. Her body was covered with bruises, burns, and cuts. Her lips were swollen, her skin was torn in multiple places, and her emaciated frame suggested prolonged starvation. This was no sudden accident, no injury inflicted by strangers on the street. This was the result of weeks of suffering. The turning point came when one of the Likens sisters, Jenny, made her move. As the officers prepared to leave, Jenny leaned toward them and whispered words that shattered the cover story. "You get me out of here, and I'll tell you everything." With that single sentence, the truth began to unravel. Jenny revealed details that stunned investigators. She spoke of the basement, of the beatings, of the starvation, and of the way Sylvia had been tormented not only by Gertrude, but by her children, and even by kids from the neighborhood. Every claim Jenny made was supported by what investigators saw on Sylvia's body: the burns, the cuts, and the words carved into her stomach. All of it painted a picture of systematic torture. As word spread, detectives began questioning the children in the Baniszewski household. At first, many of them echoed Gertrude's version of events, insisting that Sylvia had brought the injuries upon herself or that she had run away. But under pressure, the stories began to crumble. One by one, the children and neighborhood participants admitted their roles. Some described how Gertrude had ordered them to hit Sylvia. Others spoke of how they were encouraged to burn her, to cut her, to treat her like she was no longer human. The autopsy provided further confirmation. The medical examiner counted over 100 distinct injuries on Sylvia's body. Bruises covered her skin, burns were scattered across her flesh, and the words etched into her stomach told the world of the degradation she had endured. The cause of death was officially listed as a brain hemorrhage caused by repeated blows, compounded by malnutrition and shock. For the investigators, this case was unlike anything they had seen. Seasoned officers who had handled homicides and violent crimes admitted they were shaken by the cruelty inflicted on Sylvia Likens. Detectives described the case as one of the most disturbing in the history of Indianapolis. With Gertrude and her children in custody, along with several neighborhood kids, the question now turned to justice. How could a court of law even begin to address the scale of this crime? How would the justice system handle not only an adult orchestrator, but also the children who had joined in? The stage was set for a trial that would shock the nation, expose the darkest corners of human behavior, and force the public to confront an uncomfortable truth: that an entire community had failed to protect a 16-year-old girl named Sylvia Likens. The trial of Gertrude Baniszewski and her accomplices began in 1966, only months after Sylvia Likens' death. The courtroom was packed with journalists, citizens, and observers who wanted to hear how such a crime could have taken place inside a family home in their own city. From the very beginning, the atmosphere was heavy with disbelief and outrage. The names of the accused were read aloud: Gertrude Baniszewski, her daughter Paula, her son John, and two neighborhood boys, Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs. Each faced charges that reflected their level of involvement in Sylvia's torture and death. The prosecution built its case carefully. They began by presenting the testimony of medical experts. Doctors who had examined Sylvia's body described the staggering number of injuries, more than 100 marks of abuse layered over her thin frame. The autopsy photographs, though too disturbing for many to look at, confirmed the testimony. Jurors heard that Sylvia had been starved, burned, beaten, and branded. She had not simply died, she had been destroyed over a period of weeks. But it was the testimony of Jenny Likens that carried the most weight. Nervous, fragile, and still traumatized, Jenny sat before the jury and described in detail the cruelty inflicted on her sister. She spoke of nights when Sylvia begged for water and was denied, of times when Gertrude forced her to strip in front of others, of the final days when Sylvia lay weak in the basement. Jenny's words silenced the room. Even seasoned court reporters later admitted they had never heard such harrowing testimony from a child. The defense tried to shift the blame. Lawyers for Gertrude argued that she was mentally unstable, too sick and too weak to fully control what happened in her house. They suggested that the children had acted on their own, and that Gertrude's poor health left her unable to stop them. Some attempted to portray Sylvia as unruly, a girl who invited trouble, but these arguments fell flat. The overwhelming evidence and the consistency of the testimonies made it impossible to ignore Gertrude's central role. Witnesses from the neighborhood also took the stand. Some admitted that they had seen Sylvia's injuries or heard her screams. Others confessed that they had even taken part in the abuse at Gertrude's encouragement. These revelations horrified the public. How could so many have participated or stayed silent as Sylvia suffered? After weeks of testimony, closing arguments were delivered. The prosecution reminded the jury that Sylvia Likens was a child, placed in a home by parents who believed she would be cared for. Instead, she had been subjected to unspeakable cruelty. The defense repeated their claims of Gertrude's illness, but the damage had been done. The jury deliberated for hours before delivering their verdicts. Gertrude Baniszewski was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Paula Baniszewski, who had been heavily involved in the abuse, was convicted of second-degree murder. John Baniszewski, Coy Hubbard, and Richard Hobbs were convicted of manslaughter. The verdicts brought some measure of justice, but they did not erase the horror of what Sylvia endured. As the sentences were read, the courtroom was filled with a mix of relief, sorrow, and lingering shock. This case was unlike any other. It was not only the story of one woman's cruelty, but of an entire group of people who allowed it to happen. For the family of Sylvia Likens, the verdicts could never undo their loss. For the city of Indianapolis, the trial was a reminder of the darkness that can exist behind closed doors, even in the most ordinary of neighborhoods. The trial ended with convictions, but the story of Sylvia Likens did not close in that courtroom. The aftermath of her death and the events that followed left deep scars on the community, reshaped discussions about child welfare, and haunted every individual who had come into contact with her case. In Indianapolis, the reaction was immediate. Citizens who had followed the trial were stunned by the sheer brutality that had taken place inside a modest home on East New York Street. Many asked themselves how such suffering could go unnoticed for so long. Neighbors who had heard screams or seen Sylvia's injuries were forced to reckon with their silence. Their guilt lingered. For some, the memory of Sylvia's cries became an unbearable reminder of the consequences of inaction. The justice system had punished Gertrude Baniszewski with a life sentence, but that was only part of the story. Paula Baniszewski, convicted of second-degree murder, eventually gave birth while awaiting trial. She was later paroled, attempting to live quietly, though her name remained linked forever to the events that destroyed Sylvia's life. John Baniszewski, Coy Hubbard, and Richard Hobbs, all teenagers at the time of the crime, received shorter sentences and were eventually released. Each of them struggled under the weight of public scrutiny. Richard Hobbs died of cancer at the age of 21, just a few years after the trial. Gertrude herself served 20 years before being granted parole in 1985, a decision that sparked outrage from the community and from Sylvia's surviving family. By then, she insisted that she had found God and changed her ways, but many refused to believe that any amount of time or repentance could erase what she had done. She lived the remainder of her life in relative obscurity, dying in 1990. For Sylvia's family, her release had felt like a second betrayal. The case of Sylvia Likens also prompted wider discussions about the protection of children. Though no immediate legislation was passed as a direct result, the story became a reference point in debates about mandatory reporting laws, child services oversight, and community responsibility. Advocates argued that no child should ever suffer what Sylvia had endured, and that intervention systems needed to be stronger, more proactive, and more vigilant. Beyond the legal and social consequences, the case raised troubling questions about psychology and human behavior. How could so many children participate in such cruelty? Why did bystanders choose silence rather than intervention? Psychologists later suggested that groupthink and authority played roles. Children who feared Gertrude's authority may have joined in to protect themselves, while others became desensitized, treating Sylvia's suffering as if it were a grim pastime. Still, the level of brutality was far beyond what most could explain. It exposed a capacity for violence within ordinary people, given the right circumstances. Even decades later, theories persist. Some believe that poverty, desperation, and social neglect created the perfect conditions for cruelty to thrive inside the Baniszewski home. Others see it as a chilling example of evil that defies explanation, but all agree on one truth: Sylvia Likens was failed by Gertrude, by the children, by the neighbors, and by the adults who did not act soon enough. Her story endures as one of the darkest chapters in true crime history, a reminder that silence can kill, and that vigilance and compassion are the only weapons against such cruelty. The story of Sylvia Likens is not an easy one to tell, nor is it an easy one to hear. Even after all these years, the details remain as haunting as they were in 1965. To reflect on her case is to reflect on the failure of every safeguard that should have protected her, and on the capacity of ordinary people to commit or allow acts of extraordinary cruelty. Sylvia was only 16 years old. She was not a hardened criminal, not someone who posed a threat to anyone. She was a girl with dreams, with a gentle nature, and with the same vulnerabilities that come with youth. Her life should have been filled with opportunities to grow, to learn, and to experience the world around her. Instead, it was cut short in a way so brutal that it continues to shock generation after generation. The conclusion of the trial may have brought punishment to those directly responsible, but the deeper wound remains, the recognition that Sylvia was betrayed at every level. She was betrayed by Gertrude Baniszewski, who was trusted to care for her. She was betrayed by the children who saw her not as a peer, but as a target. She was betrayed by neighbors who ignored the warning signs, and by a society that had no system in place to detect or intervene in the abuse. The lessons of her case are uncomfortable but necessary. It shows us how silence can be just as destructive as action. Those who heard Sylvia's cries but did not report them share in the weight of her suffering. It reminds us that cruelty can take root in the most ordinary places, in a rented home on a quiet street, in a family that seemed, at first glance, unremarkable. For the true crime community, the case of Sylvia Likens stands as one of the most extreme examples of prolonged abuse and group participation in violence. It is often referred to as America's child torture murder, a phrase that captures the horror but cannot truly convey the human cost. To this day, filmmakers, writers, and historians struggle with how to present Sylvia's story without exploitation because the reality itself is almost unbearable. But her story endures not only because of the cruelty she endured, but because of what it teaches us. It forces us to ask, what responsibility do we carry for the vulnerable among us? When we see signs of suffering, will we act or will we turn away? And how do we ensure that no child is ever again placed in the care of someone unworthy of trust? Sylvia Likens' name deserves to be remembered, not just as the victim of an unimaginable crime, but as a symbol of the consequences of indifference. Her life should inspire vigilance, compassion, and action. For every viewer, the story is a reminder that protecting the vulnerable is not someone else's responsibility, it is ours. If you found this case compelling and believe in the importance of remembering stories like Sylvia's, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And most importantly, let us honor Sylvia's memory by refusing to remain silent in the face of cruelty.